Caleb Vance was eating the perfectly poached egg Sloane had made for him when he found the hotel receipt on her phone. He crushed the eggshell in his fist, a sharp shard piercing his palm. Blood mingled with the runny yolk, staining Sloane's favorite white linen tablecloth. "Sloane, you said you were working late last night. Were you at the University District Clarion, room 303? Sloane's eyelashes fluttered like the wings of a dying butterfly. Caleb didn't scream or make a scene. He simply turned around and threw the platinum engagement ring he'd spent 5 years saving for down the kitchen drain. 3 months later, the man she'd been with lost both his legs in a horrific car accident. Curiously, every surveillance camera near the scene had malfunctioned at the exact same time. Caleb swallowed the last bite of the egg. The white was tender, the yolk velvety and warm against his tongue. Sloane always timed her poached eggs perfectly. They had been his only anchor during the long nights after driving 10-hour shifts for Uber. The sound of running water drifted from the kitchen. Sloane was washing the dishes, her slender silhouette framed by the light, wearing that floral apron that had grown faded from too many washes. He reached for her phone on the table, just intending to check the time. The screen lit up, and a notification, one she hadn't managed to clear, pierced his eyes like a frozen needle. Clarion Hotel, University District. Reservation for room 303 confirmed. Check-in, 8:00 p.m. Enjoy your stay. The timestamp was 7:30 p.m. the previous evening. The warmth in Caleb's mouth turned to shards of ice. It felt like a weight dropping through his chest, bruising every organ on its way down. He remembered clearly. Before Sloane had left the house last night, she'd been applying lipstick in the hallway mirror. She turned her head, offering him a soft smile. "Don't wait up, Caleb. This project is on a deadline. It's going to be an all-nighter." Her lipstick had been a gentle, dusty rose, shimmering under the hallway light. She had looked breathtaking. The screen went dark. Caleb's fingers remained frozen in place, his knuckles turning a ghostly white from the tension. The water stopped. Sloane walked out, drying her hands, her face flushed with the warmth of the chores. "Finished?" she asked brightly. "Give me the plate." She reached for his empty dish. Before her fingers could graze the porcelain, Caleb snapped his head up. His eyes were dark, heavy like the clouds before a devastating storm. They held a raw, feral intensity she had never seen before. Sloane's hand froze in midair. Her heart skipped a beat under his gaze, and her smile faltered. "What is it? Why are you looking at me like that?" Caleb didn't say a word. He just stared at her. He picked up the empty bowl, still smeared with a trace of golden yolk, and his fingers slowly tightened. The thin porcelain groaned under the immense pressure of his grip, then shattered with a sharp crack in his palm. Sharp fragments sliced into his skin instantly. Bright red beads of blood raced to the surface, mixing with the sticky remnants of the egg. It dripped steadily onto the snow-white velvet runner she loved so much. The blood and yolk spread together, forming a grotesque, jagged abstract painting on the fabric. Sloane gasped, her face turning deathly pale. "Caleb, what are you doing?" She lunged forward to grab his hand. Caleb swung his arm back, avoiding her touch. He pointed his blood-stained hand at her, his fingertips trembling, but his voice was terrifyingly low, a sound dragged from the depths of a frozen abyss. "Sloane." He paused, each word feeling like a serrated blade cutting through the air. "Last night, you said you were at the office. Were you at the Clarion, room 303? The world seemed to explode in Sloane's mind. A deafening roar filled her ears, leaving her thoughts a total blank. The blood rushed to her head and then drained away a second later, leaving her shivering. It felt like she'd been struck by an invisible sledgehammer. She staggered back, her spine slamming into the cold metal of the refrigerator. She opened her mouth, but her throat felt like it was clogged with hot sand. Not a sound came out. Only her beautiful eyes betrayed her, widening in terror, her thick lashes shaking like the wings of a butterfly caught in a hurricane. The air in the room solidified. The only sounds were Caleb's heavy, ragged breathing and the rhythmic, sickening tap of blood hitting the tablecloth. A few seconds of dead silence felt like a century. Caleb's gaze moved from Sloane's ghost-white face to the expanding stain on the table. He suddenly pulled the corner of his mouth into a twisted, hideous grin that looked more painful than crying. There were no questions, no doubting, not even a single tear. He turned abruptly, moving like a gust of wind carrying the scent of iron. In a few strides, he was in their cramped bedroom, a space that barely fit a bed and a cheap dresser. He ripped open the bottom drawer, tossing clothes aside in a violent search. Finally, he felt it. A small box tucked into the furthest corner, wrapped in layers of velvet. He had scrimped and saved, working extra shifts, counting every dollar for 5 years to buy that ring. A platinum band with a small, high-clarity diamond. He had imagined 1,000 times on a sunny afternoon, kneeling to slide it on her finger and making a promise for a lifetime. He clutched the small, cold box and walked back into the wreckage of the living room. Sloane was still frozen against the fridge. When she saw the box, her lips trembled even harder. Tears finally began to fall, heavy drops splashing onto the floor. Caleb didn't even look at her. He walked straight to the small kitchen sink. He twisted the faucet, and cold water hissed out in a violent stream. He stared into the water, his eyes terrifyingly hollow. Then, with his uninjured hand, he opened the velvet box that held 5 years of humble hope and burning love. The small diamond caught the dim light of the kitchen, reflecting a single, piercing spark. A second later, Caleb let go. That spark of light, along with the small band of metal, was instantly swallowed by the rushing water. There was a tiny metallic clink, and then it was gone, swept down the dark, winding pipes into a depth from which there was no return. The sound of the water felt unnaturally loud in the silence of the night. Caleb shut off the tap. He didn't look back. He wiped his bloody, yolk-stained hand casually on the hem of his cheap t-shirt, leaving a streak of filth behind. Then he pulled open the rusted security door and walked out. Slam! The door shook the walls as it crashed shut. The sound was the final hammer blow that shattered Sloane's remaining strength. She slid down the front of the fridge onto the floor, curling into a ball. She pressed her hands over her mouth, but the muffled, desperate wails escaped through her fingers, echoing through the cold space that now smelled of iron and eggs. Caleb vanished for 3 days. His phone was off. His Uber account was inactive. He had become a ghost. Sloane went frantic. She checked every corner of the city he might have gone to, contacted everyone they knew, even went to the police, only to be met with shrugs and looks of pity. She drifted through the cold apartment like a phantom, staring at the ruined tablecloth and the empty drawer. A piece of her heart had been hollowed out, leaving nothing but a whistling wind and a bone-deep chill. For 3 days, she didn't eat. She lived on nothing but salt and tears. She withered, her eyes sinking into dark hollows, her jawline becoming sharp enough to cut. In the early hours of the 4th day, before the sun had fully risen, the sound of a key turning in the lock echoed through the silence. That tiny click sounded like a thunderclap. Sloane bolted upright from the floor and threw herself toward the door barefoot. The door opened. Caleb stood there, shrouded in the heavy scent of stale cigarettes and the biting chill of a late autumn dawn. His hair was a mess, his jaw covered in stubble, and dark circles bruised the skin under his eyes. He was still wearing the same stained t-shirt from 3 days ago, though the spots had turned dark and crusty. He had lost weight. His cheekbones protruded, and his eyes were like 2 dry wells, bottomless and void of emotion. No anger, no sadness. Just a terrifying, dead silence. Caleb. Sloane's voice shook violently, a mix of hysterical relief and crushing fear. She reached out to touch him. Caleb acted as if he didn't see her hand, as if he didn't hear her voice. He shouldered past her into the apartment, his movements stiff, and walked straight to the small bathroom. Soon, the sound of the shower filled the air. Sloane stood paralyzed in the hallway, her hands still hanging in the empty air, her fingertips icy. The relief was instantly snuffed out by a bucket of ice water, leaving only a heavy, sinking dread. She looked at the closed bathroom door, listening to the water, and realized for the first time that the Caleb who had once held her like she was the world, the man who would drive across the city just to see her smile, had been flushed away with that ring. From that day on, Caleb was back, but not entirely. He still drove for Uber, working harder than ever. He pulled maximum hours, coming home so exhausted he'd either collapse in a bed or sit staring at his old laptop, the blue light reflecting off his expressionless face. He never mentioned room 303. He never mentioned the ring. He never explained where he'd been for those 3 days. There was only silence, a silence so thick it was suffocating, like an invisible wall of cold glass separating him from Sloane completely. He stopped eating the food Sloane cooked. When he was hungry, he'd boil a pot of plain, tasteless noodles for himself, or eat a cold sandwich. At night, he slept with his back to her, leaving a gap between them wide enough for another person to fit. Occasionally, Sloane would gather her courage and try to explain through her tears or offer some clumsy gesture of affection. Caleb's reaction was always the same, either a prolonged silence or a sudden, sharp look, eyes like a frozen lake. One glance was enough to freeze the words in her throat, leaving her shivering. Sloane felt like she was drowning in that silence. She was like an insect trapped in a glass jar. She could see the world outside, but she couldn't break through the barrier. She wasted away, the light in her eyes dimming day by day. Time crawled through the tension. 3 months passed. The chill of early winter began to seep into the city's bones. One evening, Caleb came home earlier than usual. Sloane was mechanically scrubbing the stained tablecloth, the one she refused to throw away, as if cleaning it could fix their lives. When the door opened, she looked up like a startled rabbit. Caleb didn't look at her. He tossed his car keys onto the shoe rack with a sharp clack. He walked into the small living room and turned on the old television. The local news was on. The anchor's voice filled the cramped space. Updating our top story. A severe traffic accident occurred near the University District Shopping Center at approximately 5 p.m. today. A black Volkswagen was exiting a parking garage when the driver reportedly lost control, striking a concrete pillar at high speed. The male driver sustained critical injuries, including severe crushing of both legs. He is currently undergoing emergency surgery at City General. His condition remains life-threatening. According to witnesses, the surveillance system in the area suffered a mysterious, total failure just before and after the crash. Police are investigating the cause. The screen cut to the accident scene. The mangled front end of the black Volkswagen was wrapped around a massive metal pole. Shards of glass and car parts littered the asphalt, alongside a sickening, dark red pool of blood that hadn't quite dried. The camera panned over personal items scattered on the ground, a crushed cigarette pack, a half-empty water bottle, and Sloane's pupils contracted. A familiar thermos with the logo of a trendy tea shop she knew well. It was the birthday gift she had given Julian 4 months ago. An icy chill shot from the soles of her feet to the top of her skull. She whipped her head around to look at Caleb. Caleb was standing in front of the TV, his back to her. The flickering light of the broadcast cast moving shadows across his broad shoulders. The news continued, identifying the victim as Mr. Thorne, an employee at a local tech firm. Caleb watched in total silence. His face was a mask of indifference, as if he were watching a weather report for a city he didn't live in. But when the reporter mentioned the mysterious surveillance failure, the corner of his mouth twitched upward for a fraction of a second. It was a faint, fleeting movement, so fast she might have imagined it, but it carried a bone-chilling coldness. Sloane felt her blood turn to ice. She looked at Caleb's back, the back of the man she had loved for years, the man she knew intimately, and it felt utterly alien. A terrifying thought coiled in her mind like a viper, biting deep. It was him. Caleb did this. This wasn't an accident. A massive wave of fear gripped her, making it impossible to breathe. She didn't know how he'd done it, or what he'd planned during those 3 missing days. She only knew that the quiet, patient Caleb, the man who used to look away when she prepared a chicken for dinner, now looked like a demon climbed out of the pits of hell. The news ended, and a loud commercial began. Caleb picked up the remote and clicked the TV off. The room plunged into gloom, with only the city lights outside outlining his silent, cold silhouette. He didn't turn around. He walked straight into the bedroom. Sloane stood there, a statue of ice. In a moment the light of the TV died, it felt like the light of her entire world had gone with it. Darkness rushed in from every corner, carrying the scent of iron and the screech of twisting metal. The news of Julian Thorne's double amputation hit Sloane's world like a bomb. She looked at the photo a friend sent of Julian's mother weeping hysterically in the hospital hallway, and felt the air leave her lungs. The once charming, arrogant Julian was now pinned to a wheelchair for life, and she was the one who had pushed him over the edge. Her one moment of weakness had started this. A deeper fear, like freezing seawater, drowned her. She was terrified for Julian's future, but even more terrified of what Caleb would do next. The destructive madness lurking beneath his calm eyes made her skin crawl. She could see Caleb standing at the edge of a cliff, holding a lit fuse, and at the other end of that fuse were Julian, her, and maybe everyone they knew. No, I have to stop him. I have to pull him back before he falls into the abyss. That thought became her only lifeline. She began to try, desperately, to communicate with him, to tear down the wall of his silence. Caleb, we need to talk. Please. I know I messed up. I am sorry. She would throw herself at him when he walked through the door, clutching his arm so hard her nails dug into his skin, her voice raw with tears. Caleb would simply shake her off as if brushing away a piece of lint, his eyes never even flickering toward her face. She would set plates of hot food in front of him, her voice a humble plea. Please eat. You've been driving all day. Caleb wouldn't even look. He'd either stand up and leave or scrape the food into the trash right in front of her with a dull thud. In the dead of night, while he lay with his back to her, his breathing steady as if he were asleep, Sloane would carefully crawl toward him. She would wrap her arms around his cold body, pressing her face against his thin back, her hot tears soaking his old t-shirt. "Caleb, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Just give me one chance. Please." Caleb's body would instantly go rigid, like a sheet of iron. Then, slowly and irresistibly, he would pry her fingers off his waist and move away, reopening the icy chasm between them. The whole time, he never said a word. His silence was sharper than any scream, like a rusted blade sawing at her heart day after day. Sloane felt herself being roasted over a slow fire, her strength and hope evaporating. Just as she was about to break, another blow landed. Julian's family had somehow found out about her. They labeled her the temptress who destroyed Julian's life and vowed to make her pay. People were even seen loitering outside her office. The terror peaked. Sloane knew Caleb would find out. In his current state, a threat to Sloane from Julian's family would be like pouring gasoline on a fire. What would he do? What could be more insane than what he'd already done? Panic seized her heart. She couldn't wait any longer. She had to use the most extreme, direct method to make him stop, even if it cost her everything. The opportunity came unexpectedly. One afternoon, Caleb took a long-distance fare to an industrial park on the outskirts of the city. Sloane, acting on a desperate impulse, hailed a cab and followed his familiar gray sedan from a distance. The gray car merged onto the main road, leading to the suburbs as traffic thinned out. Sloane's heart hammered against her ribs. Her palms were slick with sweat. Finally, near a massive logistics hub, they hit heavy congestion. Caleb's car was trapped in the middle of a long line, inching forward. To the side was a service lane meant for heavy freight trucks, where traffic was moving slightly faster. Sloane saw her chance. She shoved the cab door open, ignoring the driver's startled shout. She bolted like an arrow toward Caleb's gray car. Her eyes were locked on its silhouette. She had only one thought: stop him. Use myself as leverage to force him to stop. She sprinted into the freight lane. At that exact moment, a heavy semi-truck, fully loaded, roared out of the logistics center. Its massive frame rumbled as it accelerated toward her. The air horn shrieked like the voice of death itself. Sloane didn't hear it. She didn't see it. Her entire focus was locked on the driver's seat of the gray sedan 20 yards away. She saw Caleb's face in the window, a face that suddenly contorted in shock and disbelief. "Caleb!" Sloane screamed with everything she had, her voice cracking in the winter air, fueled by a reckless, suicidal desperation. "Stop it. Just stop it. Every time you hurt him, I'm going to hurt myself just as much." The words, screamed like a curse, pierced through the roar of the truck and the chaos of the honking horns. In a heartbeat before the massive shadow of the truck could swallow her tiny frame, crech, a sound so sharp it felt like it was tearing her eardrums, erupted from Caleb's direction. Sloane saw the gray sedan out of the corner of her eye. It lunged out of the stationary traffic like a wounded predator. With a suicidal maneuver, it veered into the freight lane, tires smoking as it slammed into the path of the oncoming semi. Boom! The sound was heavy enough to stop a heart. The small sedan was tossed aside like a toy by a giant, rolling over as car parts and glass exploded into the air like dark fireworks. The impact forced the truck to a halt, its front end crumpling with a sickening metallic groan. The world went silent. Sloane stood frozen, less than 10 yards from the wreckage. The smell of dust and gasoline choked her. She stared at the twisted, smoking heap of metal, her mind a complete blank. Time stretched. Every second felt like a century. Clatter. A faint sound. The mangled driver's side door was kicked open a few inches. A hand, covered in blood and grime, reached out, gripping the warped frame. Then Caleb emerged. He crawled out of that smoking steel grave. A jagged gash on his temple sent blood pouring down half his face, dripping from his chin. One arm hung at an unnatural angle, his clothes shredded, his skin a road map of scrapes and bruises. He swayed as he stood, like a blade of grass in a gale. His gaze cut through the dust and the debris, pinning itself on Sloane, who stood there like a ghost. His eyes were no longer frozen lakes. They were burning with the fires of hell. Rage, terror, disbelief, and a predatory madness that suggested he had been pushed past the point of no return. He took one step, then another, dragging his injured leg as he stumbled toward her. Every step looked like he was walking on glass, but he moved with the weight of an approaching storm. Blood dripped from his brow, hitting the cold pavement. Sloane trembled under the heat of his gaze and instinctively took a step back. Caleb finally reached her. The smell of copper and grit was overwhelming. His blood-stained hand shot out, not to strike her, but to grip her shoulder like an iron vise. The pressure was so intense it felt like he might crush the bone. His bloodshot eyes bored into her terrified pupils. His voice was a sandpaper rasp, every word tasting of iron as he spat in her face. "Sloane, you got some nerve." The distant wail of an ambulance cut through the chaos of the scene. Sloane was led away by paramedics like a puppet, but her eyes were welded to the man on the stretcher, the man covered in blood, slipping into unconsciousness. Even as they lifted him, Caleb's uninjured hand was clenched into a white-knuckled fist, as if he were fighting something even in his blackout. The ER lights were a piercing, painful red. Sloane sat huddled on a cold plastic chair in the hallway, covered in road dust and the sweat of terror. She hugged her knees, unable to stop shaking. Caleb's final, bloody rasp. "You've got some nerve," played on a loop in her head, punctuated by the screech of brakes and the roar of the crash. Time crawled. Seconds felt like years. Fear, regret, and horror gnawed at her heart. She couldn't imagine the extent of his injuries, and she couldn't imagine what she would do if he... The surgery lasted hours. When the heavy doors finally swung open and a weary doctor in green scrubs emerged, Sloane practically lunged at him, her legs nearly giving out. "Doctor, is he? He's alive." The doctor pulled off his mask, his expression grave. Minor skull fracture, a concussion, a fractured ulna in the left arm, 2 broken ribs, and significant soft tissue damage. He lost a lot of blood. He's lucky. The truck managed to break enough at the end that the cabin wasn't completely crushed. However, there's a fracture in the left tibia as well. He'll need a long time to recover. We're moving him to the ICU for 24-hour observation to watch for internal bleeding. Hearing the words, "He's alive," the tension that had held Sloane together snapped. The world went dark for a moment, and she had to lean against the wall to keep from collapsing. Tears flooded out, the pure exhaustion of survival. When Caleb was wheeled out, his face was hidden behind an oxygen mask. He was as pale as paper, his forehead swathed in gauze, his visible skin a map of purple bruises and scabs. His left arm was in a heavy cast. He looked as fragile as a glass doll. Sloane tried to reach for him, but a nurse gently blocked her. He was wheeled behind the heavy glass doors of the intensive care unit. Sloane could only watch through the glass, seeing the flashing lights of the monitors and hearing the rhythmic, cold beep-beep-beep of the machines keeping him stable. She slid down the wall outside the ICU. The chill of the tiles seeped through her clothes. She curled up, burying her face in her knees, her shoulders shaking silently. This time, the tears weren't just about fear. They were heavy with a dark, suffocating despair. She had pushed him to this. She had used a suicide attempt to break him. How were they supposed to go on? Hours passed, maybe a day. Heavy footsteps echoed down the hall. Sloane looked up through blurry eyes to see 2 police officers approaching. "Sloane Reed," the lead officer asked, his face stern. "We need a statement regarding the accident near the logistics hub this afternoon." Sloane's heart sank. She nodded mechanically, using the wall to pull herself up. Her legs were still weak. The officer's questions hit her like cold bullets. "Why were you there? Why did you run into the road? What is your relationship to Caleb Vance? Were you arguing before the crash? Do you know why he suddenly drove into the freight lane?" Sloane's mind was a mess. How could she answer? "I went there to stop my boyfriend from murdering my ex. Caleb crashed his car to save me from killing myself." It sounded insane. She could only offer a pale, rambling explanation. I was following him. I was worried about him. A truck came. I didn't see it. He saved me." Her explanation was weak, riddled with holes. The officer's sharp gaze suggested he didn't buy it. They had talked to the cab driver and other witnesses. Some saw her jump out of the cab. Some heard her screaming. But in the chaos, no one caught the specifics. Most assumed Caleb's maneuver was simply a heroic act to save a woman in the road. The investigation is ongoing, including an analysis of Mr. Vance's driving state and intent. Keep your phone on. We'll likely have more questions. The officer closed his notebook and gave the ICU door a long, complicated look before leaving. The interrogation felt like another set of chains. Sloane sat back down, watching Caleb's lifeless profile through the glass. A wave of helplessness washed over her. During the 24 hours of ICU observation, Sloane didn't move. She didn't close her eyes, afraid she'd miss a doctor. She ate scraps of bread and drank cold water. When she finally dozed off against the wall, she was jolted awake by nightmares of screeching brakes, twisted metal, and Caleb's bloody face snarling, "You've got some nerve." The next afternoon, Caleb stabilized and was moved to a private room. The anesthesia was still wearing off, so he spent most of his time in a drug-induced sleep. Sloane stayed by his side, heart breaking at the sight of the bandages. She used a cotton swab to wet his parched, cracked lips. As evening fell, Caleb's eyelashes flickered. He slowly opened his eyes. They were unfocused at first, but finally settled on Sloane's face. Sloane's heart leaped in her throat. She watched him tensely, her voice dry. "Caleb, you're awake? How do you feel? Does it hurt?" She instinctively reached out to touch his forehead. Caleb's gaze lingered on her face for a few seconds. There was no relief there, no concern for her, not even the weakness of a man waking from surgery. There was only a bottomless, freezing cold, colder than before the crash. It was like the permafrost of a wasteland, carrying a judgmental, indifferent edge that seemed to pierce right through her. Sloane's hand froze in midair. He looked away, staring at the white ceiling. His cracked lips moved slightly, and his voice, though weak and raspy, was sharp as an ice pick. "Get out." 2 words, light as a feather, yet they felt like red-hot irons branding Sloane's heart, leaving a searing, smoking scar. Her hand dropped. Her blood felt like it had turned to ice. After he spoke, Caleb closed his eyes as if the effort had exhausted him, effectively shutting her out of his world. His pale face was a mask of indifference, radiating an absolute, bone-weary coldness. Sloane stood there, paralyzed. A wave of humiliation and despair crashed over her. She looked at his closed eyes, at his bandaged body, wounds he had taken to save her. And now, he couldn't even stand to look at her. Tears fell silently. Sloane bit her lip until she tasted copper, forcing back the sobs. She didn't leave. Instead, she retreated to the corner of the room, curling up in the uncomfortable visitor's chair like an abandoned, wounded animal. The room was silent except for the rhythmic beep of the monitors and Caleb's shallow, heavy breathing. The silence was a weight on her chest, making every breath hurt. As the anesthesia fully wore off, the pain returned with a vengeance. Caleb shifted restlessly in the bed, sweat breaking out on his forehead. His jaw was clamped shut, suppressing groans of agony. The broken ribs and a fractured leg flared with every tiny movement. A nurse came in to adjust his pain pump. The cool medication flowed through the fore, slowly dulling the edge of the torment. Caleb's brow smoothed slightly as he drifted back into a shallow sleep. Sloane watched him from her corner, her heart aching. She wanted to hold his hand, to give him some small comfort as she used to when he was sick. But she didn't dare. That "get out" was an invisible wall, keeping her in exile. Night deepened. Moonlight filtered through the blinds, casting cold stripes across the floor. In his sleep, Caleb moved his injured left arm, catching it on the sheets. He let out a low, muffled moan of pain. Sloane sat up instantly, watching him. The clear tube of the pain pump swayed slightly with his movement. Suddenly, her gaze was caught by something on the nightstand. It was a tiny fragment of a glass vial, left behind by the nurse, no bigger than a fingernail, with a jagged, razor-sharp edge that glinted in the moonlight. A thought, like a poisonous vine growing in the dark, coiled around her fraying nerves. She stared at the glass, then at the 4-tube connected to Caleb's hand. That thin plastic line was his only connection to relief. He had said, "Every time you hurt him, I'm going to hurt myself just as much." Julian was in a hospital bed with no legs. Caleb was here, shattered and broken, because of her. How many cuts was that? The debt she owed seemed infinite. Caleb's cold eyes and his demand for her to leave replayed in her head like a poisoned whip. He didn't want her care. He didn't want her penance. He didn't even want her in his sight. What was left? How could she prove her regret? How could she pay for what she'd done? Despair choked her. She needed an outlet, something he would see, something that would move him even a fraction. Even if it was blood, even if it was pain. Sloane's eyes became hollow, manic. Like a sleepwalker, she stood up silently and moved to the nightstand. Her trembling fingers picked up the cold, sharp glass. The edge sliced her fingertip, a bead of crimson appearing, but she felt nothing. She moved to Caleb's bedside. He was still asleep, his brow furrowed in a dream of pain. The 4-tube was right there, vulnerable. Sloane's breathing became ragged. She looked at the tube that kept him in peace, then down at the bloody glass in her hand. A sacrificial madness took hold of her. She raised her hand and, with all her strength, slashed the sharp glass across the plastic tube. Snip! The tube was severed. The cool medication, mixed with air, sprayed out of the breach. Ugh! Caleb's body jerked in the bed. It wasn't the glass. It was the sudden, violent return of the pain as the medication stopped. The agony woke like a sleeping beast, consuming him. He groaned, sweat pouring down his face as his eyes snapped open. The first thing he saw was Sloane standing over him, clutching a bloody piece of glass, her face pale as a ghost, her eyes empty and wild. And the foreline was spraying fluid everywhere. "Sloane, what the hell are you doing?" Caleb roared, his voice cracking with pain and shock. He tried to reach out, but his cast and his injuries pinned him down. Sloane seemed to snap out of it, or perhaps she was simply terrified by what she'd done. She stared at the glass, then at Caleb's contorted face. Suddenly, a new light of madness flickered in her eyes. She raised her hand and turned the jagged glass toward the vein in her own wrist. "You're insane!" Caleb screamed, his eyes nearly bursting. The sheer horror of it momentarily eclipsed his own physical pain. He tried to lunge for her, but he was trapped. He could only watch as she drove the glass toward her skin. At the final second, stop. The door flew open. A nurse on rounds burst in, catching the horrific scene. She moved with lightning speed, grabbing Sloane's wrist and pinning it. "Let me go. Let me." Sloane fought like a cornered animal, her eyes crazed. "Let me do it. He has broken bones. Julian has no legs. It's my fault. Let me pay. Let me pay them back." The nurse struggled to hold her. Sloane was stronger in her mania, and the glass was inches from her skin. Slap. The sound was sharp and deafening. Sloane's head snapped to the side, and her struggling stopped instantly. She touched her cheek, looking toward the bed in stunned silence. It was Caleb. He had used his uninjured right hand to deliver a brutal slap. The effort had pulled at his chest, sending him into a fit of violent coughing. His face turned from pale to a deep, angry red, the veins in his neck bulging. But his eyes were like hot brands pinned to her face, burning with rage, horror, and a bottomless, desperate pain. "Cough. Sloane." He choked out her name, every word tasting of blood. You're really going to lose it, aren't you?" He gasped for air, his body shaking with pain and fury, his hand still clenched into a white-knuckled fist. His bloodshot eyes stared her down, a terrifying fire behind them. He spoke one syllable at a time, using his last bit of strength. "You want to go crazy? I'll go with you." That slap, sharp and stinging, acted like a bolt of lightning that cleared the fog in Sloane's mind. Her face burned, and his raspy, bloody roar, "I'll go with you," echoed alongside the nurse's panicked shouts. Her senses finally returned. She touched her face, staring at Caleb. He was gasping for breath, his face turning from red back to a sickly white. The fire in his eyes wasn't just cold hatred anymore. It was a mutual, suicidal desperation. The nurse took the chance to wrestle the glass from her hand. "Hold her down. Call for help." Another orderly rushed in. Sloane didn't fight back this time. She collapsed to the floor like her bones had turned to water, and the tears finally came, not out of self-pity, but a crushing, soul-deep horror at what she'd almost done. She had almost ended her life right in front of him. The room became a blur of doctors and nurses. The staff worked quickly to fix Caleb's severed fore and restart the pain management. Under the influence of the drugs and the exhaustion of the ordeal, Caleb eventually drifted back into a heavy stupor. A nurse performed a quick cleanup of the small cut on Sloane's arm. It wasn't deep, but it had bled enough to stain her sleeve. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" a doctor asked sternly, looking down at Sloane as she sat huddled on the floor. "Destroying medical equipment, self-harm, that's a legal matter, and you could have killed him. Do you know how dangerous it is for a post-op patient to have their pain meds cut off like that? Not to mention the risk of an air embolism." Sloane just kept her head down, her shoulders shaking. "No matter how upset you are, you cannot do this. Do we need to call your family? You need a psychiatric evaluation." "No. Please." Sloane looked up, her face a mess of tears and terror. "Please don't tell anyone. I promise. I won't do it again. I was wrong. I'm so sorry." She couldn't let anyone else know, especially not Julian's family. She couldn't imagine the fallout. The doctor looked at her, then at the sleeping Caleb, and finally sighed. "We'll be checking this room every 30 minutes. You must promise there will be no more outbursts. If there are, we will call the police and have you restrained." Sloane nodded frantically. In the days that followed, Sloane became like a ghost. She didn't dare go near the nightstand. She didn't touch anything that could be used as a weapon. She stayed in the room, but she sat in the corner, a silent shadow. She watched Caleb constantly. When he needed water, she'd make sure his straw cup was full and within reach. When he winced in pain, she'd call the nurse immediately. When he slept, She'd move silently to his side and use a warm cloth to wipe the sweat from his brow. Every time she got close, she held her breath, ready to bolt if he looked at her with hate or told her to leave. But strangely, since that night, Caleb never told her to leave again. He remained silent, mostly keeping his eyes closed. Occasionally, when he did look at her, the expression was too complex for her to read. Remnants of anger, deep exhaustion, and a heavy, lingering scrutiny. He stopped refusing the water or food she placed on the nightstand, but he still wouldn't take anything directly from her hands. She would slice an apple into small pieces and leave them by his hand. He would just stare at them until they turned brown and the orderly took them away. This silent, fragile standoff lasted nearly a month. Caleb's injuries were healing. He could sit up now, and the bruising on his face had faded, but his eyes remained bottomless. One afternoon, a nurse finished helping Caleb clean up and left. The two of them were alone. Sunlight streamed through the blinds, painting stripes across the white sheets. Sloane was sitting in her corner with a small pair of scissors, carefully trimming the stems of some carnations a visitor had brought, trying to bring a bit of life into the sterile room. The metal of the scissors caught the light. Caleb, propped up against his pillows, watched her hands, then moved his gaze to her face. She had lost so much weight. Her jaw was sharp, and the shadows under her eyes were deep. The room was quiet, save for the rhythmic snip of the scissors. Sloane. Caleb's voice was still raspy, but it wasn't a roar. It was calm, devoid of obvious emotion. Sloane's hand jerked, the sharp tip of the scissors nearly slicing her finger. She looked up, startled, clutching the scissors tight. Caleb's gaze dropped from her face to the scissors in her hand. He stared at them for a few seconds. Sloane followed his gaze and realized what he must be thinking. An icy shiver ran down her spine. Is he thinking about the glass? Does he think I'm going to? Shame and panic flooded her. She dropped the scissors as if they had turned into red-hot coals. They hit the floor with a loud metallic clang. I wasn't. Sloane's voice was thick with tears as she scrambled to explain, her face white. I was just the flowers. She was rambling, her whole body shaking with the need to defend herself. Caleb watched her frantic reaction, his brow furrowing slightly. He didn't speak. He simply turned his head back toward the window. The silence returned. The scissors lay on the floor, glinting in the sun. Sloane leaned against the wall and slid down to the floor, burying her face in her knees, weeping silently. She felt like a pathetic joke. She couldn't even pick up a pair of scissors without it looking like a crime. After a long time, a raspy, tired voice broke the silence. Put the flowers in the vase. Put the flowers in the vase. Those 5 words were so soft they were almost a sigh, but to Sloane, they sounded like a choir of angels. She thought she was hallucinating. She looked up through her tears at Caleb's profile. He was still looking out the window, his jawline bathed in the pale gold of the afternoon sun. But the words were real. Sloane's heart felt like it had been struck by something heavy, a mix of ache and a tiny, unbelievable spark of hope. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, scrambled up from the floor, and retrieved the scissors. She picked up the flowers she had scattered in her panic. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her hands. She trimmed the stems, removed the excess leaves, and moved with a delicacy that suggested she was afraid of breaking the air itself. She carefully placed the carnations into the glass vase on the nightstand. The pink and white petals, dotted with water, looked like a small, fragile burst of life in the room. As she set the vase down, Sloane couldn't help but look at Caleb. His gaze had shifted back from the window to the flowers. His eyes were still cool, but Sloane thought she saw a tiny ripple in the depths, something that moved beneath the ice and vanished before she could catch it. Her heart skipped a beat. Those flowers were a signal. The ice hadn't melted, but the suffocating silence had finally cracked. Caleb remained a man of few words, spending his time staring at the sky. Sloane remained cautious, never getting too close. But small changes took root. When she put a cup of water where he could reach it, he no longer ignored it. Sometimes he would reach out and take a sip. When the nurse came to change his bandages and Sloane stood by, nervously twisting her hem, Caleb's gaze would brush against her white-knuckled fingers before moving away. His mouth seemed to soften, just for a second. Once while Sloane was peeling an apple, the knife slipped and cut her finger. She let out a soft, ow, and instinctively put the finger in her mouth. Caleb looked at her, his brow twitching, but he said nothing. However, a few minutes later, when the nurse came in for checkup, he spoke up. His voice was flat. Do you have a Band-Aid? The nurse blinked. Yes. She pulled one out. Caleb didn't take it. He just tilted his head towards Sloane. The nurse understood and handed it to her. Sloane took the small strip of plastic, looking at her tiny cut and then at Caleb, who had already closed his eyes again. Her eyes welled up. She turned away to put on the bandage, the tiny sting of the cut replaced by a strange warmth that began to thaw the frost around her heart. Time passed in these small, careful steps. Caleb's recovery was going well. The cast was off his arm, and he could move around the room with a crutch. The doctor announced he could be discharged in a week to continue his recovery at home. The afternoon before his discharge, the sun was bright. Sloan was helping Caleb pace the room for his physical therapy. They were silent, the only sound being the thump-thump of the crutch and Sloan's soft reminders. Slow down. Watch your step. After a few laps, Caleb grew tired. Sloan helped him into a chair by the window. The sun felt warm on their skin. Sloan looked at the new buds on the trees outside and finally gathered the courage to speak. Her voice was thin, trembling. Caleb, after we leave, where are you going to stay? She asked carefully, afraid of the answer. Caleb looked at the greenery outside. He didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched. Just as she thought he would shut her out again, his low voice drifted through the air. The apartment. Sloan's heart jumped. A wave of joy and disbelief hit her. He said the apartment. Their home. He wasn't leaving for good. She tried to stay calm, her voice a whisper. Then, can I come back too? She held her breath, waiting for the verdict. Caleb turned his gaze from the window to her face. He studied her for a long time, her nervous eyes, her trembling hands. Finally, he let out a sigh, a sound so soft it was like a feather carrying a weariness she couldn't name. He looked back at the spring sun. If you want. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no. It was a whatever you decide. To Sloan, it was a royal pardon. The dam broke, and she began to sob. She looked away, covering her mouth to hide the sound, her shoulders shaking. Caleb didn't look at her. He just sat in the sunlight, listening to her muffled cries. His hand on his lap twitched, his fingers curling slightly. A week later, Caleb was home. Sloan had spent the previous day scrubbing the place until it shone. She had thrown away the stained tablecloth and replaced it with a clean, blue-checked one. The windows were crystal clear. Caleb's clothes were folded perfectly. When Caleb limped through the door, the small space felt bright and strangely warm. He stood in the doorway, his gaze traveling over the home that had seen so much laughter, pain, and madness. Finally, his eyes landed on Sloan, who was standing in the middle of the room, wringing her hands. Caleb walked to the table. He looked at the new blue tablecloth. Then he sat down, leaning his crutch against the wall. He didn't say thank you. He just looked up at her, his voice steady. Give me some water. Life resumed in a state of fragile peace. With his leg injury, Caleb couldn't drive for Uber. Money became a heavy weight. Their savings had been swallowed by medical bills. Sloan found a job at a department store makeup counter. She worked until her feet swelled, then came home to care for him. She was thin, the dark circles under her eyes permanent, but she worked with a stubborn, almost manic intensity. She was a good salesperson. Her numbers were high. Caleb spent his days in the apartment. He watched Sloan work herself to the bone. He never mentioned Julian, never mentioned the past. It was as if the crash and the ICU had been a nightmare they'd agreed to forget. But the fire in his eyes hadn't gone out. It was just buried. He stopped playing games and reading. Instead, he spent hours at his old laptop, his fingers flying across the keys. The screen was filled with lines of code and complex charts Sloan didn't understand. Sometimes she'd wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of typing and see him in the glow of the screen, looking like a silent statue. She never asked what he was doing. She just left a glass of water for him and went back to bed. 1 year then, 2. The trees outside turned green and then gold. Caleb's leg healed completely, but he didn't go back to driving. He grew more silent, leaving early and coming home late. Sloan only knew he was working on some kind of project. She'd hear him on the phone, his voice cold and decisive. His clothes were still simple, but they weren't old and faded anymore. He bought a new washing machine and a fridge that didn't rattle. The tension in the apartment remained like a tightly wound string, but the string didn't break. In the 3rd year, Caleb handed Sloan a business card. Quit the department store. Stop standing all day. The card read Apex Solutions, a tech company she'd never heard of. The position was executive assistant. It's a friend startup. They need people, Caleb said flatly. Go try it. She went. The office was in an old building, but the atmosphere was electric. The CEO, a man named Sterling, was an old friend of Caleb's. He was very kind to her. The work was busy, but much easier than the sales floor. Sloan felt like her life was finally moving in the right direction. Caleb grew busier. Sometimes he was gone for days. At Apex, Sloan began to realize the company had deep ties to Caleb, but she didn't ask questions. In the 5th year, the name Apex Solutions began appearing in the headlines of every financial paper in the city. The office was buzzing with talk of stock options and NASDAQ. One afternoon, Caleb came home early. He was wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his hair neat. He looked tall, cold, and powerful, a man of high status who didn't fit in their small, old apartment anymore. Sloane stared at him. He was a stranger. "Get ready," Caleb said, his voice a command. He looked at her cheap, old coat. "There's a gala tonight for the IPO." The IPO? Sloane realized what the buzzing in the office had been about. Apex was going public. And Caleb, she looked at the man before her. He wasn't just a friend of the boss. A massive realization hit her, leaving her stunned. She nodded quickly and found her best cream-colored wool dress. She'd spent 2 months' salary on it for a company party once. She put on some lipstick and fixed her hair. Caleb watched her, but said nothing. The gala was held in the city's most opulent ballroom. Crystal chandeliers, expensive perfume, and flowing champagne. A massive screen showed the live feed from the NASDAQ bell-ringing ceremony. Caleb, as a co-founder and CTO, was the star. He was surrounded by investors and reporters, handling every question with a calm, sharp confidence. He was the picture of a tech mogul. The cameras followed him everywhere. Sloane stood in a quiet corner with a glass of champagne, watching him from afar. The unreality of it was overwhelming. The man who sat in the dark with a broken laptop, the man covered in blood in the wreckage of a car, the man who told her to get out in a hospital room. And this man, are they really the same? She was happy for him, truly proud. But she also felt a deep, biting insecurity. The gap between them hadn't closed. It had become a canyon. Could they ever go back? Did they even have a back to go to? Lost in thought, she didn't notice a figure in a server's uniform pushing a cart toward Caleb. The person's hat was pulled low. Sloane's eyes were on Caleb as he toasted an investor. Suddenly, this server was only feet away from him. The man looked up. His face was twisted with a horrific, manic hatred. It was Julian Thorne's younger brother, Leo. Julian's life had been destroyed by the crash. The Thorne family had lost everything. Leo had blamed Sloane and Caleb from the start. "Caleb Vance, go to hell." Leo screamed. He pulled a dark plastic bottle from the cart, ripped the cap off, and lunged. A pungent, corrosive liquid flew through the air toward Caleb's face. The crowd screamed in terror. It happened too fast. Caleb was turning, hearing the shout, but the death liquid was already there. In that fraction of a second, a slender figure moved with the reckless speed of a moth to a flame. It was Sloane. She had only one thought. No, not again. He won't be hurt again. She threw herself in front of him, her arms wide. She slammed into Caleb, her momentum knocking him backward. Sizzle. A horrific sound erupted, followed by a sickening, burnt smell. Most of the acid hit Sloane's back as she shielded him. But Caleb, in an instinctive move to protect her, had turned and pulled her into a tight embrace. The liquid splashed across his back. Caleb let out a muffled roar of agony. His body went rigid. His suit jacket turned black and began to smoke as the acid ate through the fabric. Caleb. Sloane was unhurt in his arms. She looked up and saw his face go paper white, the veins in his forehead bulging. He was shaking, his jaw clamped shut to keep from screaming. Security tackled Leo Thorne to the ground. "Call an ambulance." Caleb was hunched over, but he wouldn't let go of Sloane. His arms were like iron bands. He looked down at her, his face a mask of torture and cold sweat. But his eyes, they were glowing with a strange, bloody light. His voice was a broken rasp, whispered into her ear. "Cough. This time, it's my turn to hurt for you, Sloane." The smell of disinfectant and burnt skin filled the emergency room. Caleb lay, face down on a bed. Doctors were cutting away his clothes, revealing horrific chemical burns across his shoulders and back. He jerked with every touch of the antiseptic, groaning like a wounded animal. He never screamed. Sloane was stuck behind the curtain, listening to his pain. She sat on the floor, her face in her hands, shaking. Again, he did it again. She felt like a curse. Every time she got near him, she destroyed him. "How is he? Doctor, please." "Second and third-degree burns," the doctor said. "It didn't hit his face or eyes, thank God. But he's going to be in a lot of pain. Skin grafts are likely. It's a long road." The recovery was a nightmare. Every dressing change was like being skinned alive. Caleb would lie there, his body tensing, his teeth grinding. He remained silent, but the silence was filled with the pressure of his agony. Sloane stayed by his side. She learned how to help the nurses. She learned how to sing the old songs he liked when the nightmares came. She quit her job to be with him. Apex staff came and went, But Caleb only gave them short instructions. The burns slowly scarred over. The skin grafts worked, but the physical therapy was brutal. He had to learn to move again against the tight, scarred skin. On the day he was discharged, the weather was beautiful. He didn't go back to the old apartment. He drove Sloan to a new, luxury high-rise. The door opened to a bright, modern space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. "We live here now," Caleb said, his voice raspy. Sloan stood in the middle of the room, feeling like it was all a dream. She watched Caleb take off his coat. His back was still stiff. "Caleb," she whispered. He stopped, but didn't turn. Can we really start over?" she asked, her voice trembling. It took everything she had to say it. Caleb was silent for a long time. Sloan's heart sank. Just as she was about to give up, he turned around. The sun outlined his silhouette. His eyes were deep, exhausted, but the coldness was gone. He didn't answer her. He just said, "Get cleaned up. Change your clothes. We're going somewhere this afternoon." Caleb drove her through the city, eventually stopping on a quiet, grimy corner in the old district. It was far from the glamour of their new life. There was a city utility truck parked near an open sewer manhole. Sloan's heart hammered. She had a feeling she knew where they were. Caleb got out of the car. He talked to a foreman, pointing at the hole. The man nodded and called down. A few minutes later, a worker covered in sludge climbed out. He opened a gloved hand. In his palm lay a tiny blackened object. It was a ring, covered in 5 years of filth and rust. The metal was dark and the stone was clouded, but a tiny spark of light still fought through the grime. Sloan stopped breathing. She covered her mouth, her eyes flooding with tears. Caleb took the ring. He used his thumb to slowly wipe away the mud. He was focused, as if he were cleaning a diamond worth millions. The platinum began to shine again, and the small stone caught the afternoon sun, reflecting a pure, brilliant light. Caleb looked up at Sloan. His eyes held 5 years of love, hate, madness, and silence. Finally, there was only a deep, weary peace. He walked to her and took her cold, shaking hand. On that old street corner, in front of the curious city workers, Caleb Vance slowly dropped to one knee. The move pulled at the scars on his back, and he winced, but he stayed upright. He looked like the poor, hopeful young man he had been 5 years ago. He slid the ring onto her finger. It was cold, and it still smelled of the dark, but it fit perfectly. Caleb looked up at her tear-stained face. His voice was a calm, heavy rasp that echoed through the quiet street. "Sloan, we're even. Story complete."